Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Kramer, and welcome to another U.S.-Europe Alliance Transatlantic Chat. Very pleased that you've been able to find time to join us today for what I'm confident is going to be an engaging discussion on global clean, how the EU and the U.S. can work together to bring clean energy to the world. As indicated, this has been part of a series. Like many others, we're engaging virtually right now. And the Transatlantic Chat Series is the place to do it, where we bring together experts on issues that we find to be of particular relevance right now to the transatlantic relationship and its community, and helping to fulfill USEA's mission of mobilizing Americans to advocate for enduring US-Europe partnership. Right now, a lot of this involves awareness raising and getting out and talking to Americans. And what we try to do is we try to identify prime spaces where we can see there's a great room for cooperation and mutual benefit between the United States and Europe. And one of those areas, I believe for some time now, has been in the energy sector. And on one hand, we have the European Union that in recent years has made clear, very clear, two policy goals of it that it has, one of which is towards greater energy security by diversifying resources. And the other one is a bit more commonly known and understood, and that is an increasing consensus in Europe about the need to use renewable sources of energy and possibly other cleaner sources of energy for those which currently exist. Meanwhile, here in the United States, many of you joining us today are aware that last year, 2019, was a big one for energy in the US, where we became the world's largest oil and gas exporter. But at the same time, American innovators have been ever more proactive in developing means of producing cleaner energy, whether it be through renewables or whether it be through cleaner use of hydrocarbon sourced energies. So today we have two distinguished experts to speak about this. First is Kyle Simpson. He is a senior advisor at the firm of Thompson and Coburn. Kyle was previously senior advisor to U.S. Secretary of Energy Ernest Moniz, as well as associate deputy secretary. Kyle, originally from Texas, works to develop environmentally superior energy products that include natural gas production, transportation, liquefied natural gas export facilities, and climate-friendly electric power generating systems. With us, we also have Anna Mikulska, who has a number of titles and affiliations because of her in-depth work in the energy sector. One would be at Baker Institute at Rice University, where she's a fellow. Anna is also a scholar at the Kleinman Center at Penn University and is a fellow, if not a senior fellow perhaps, at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, which is where Anna and I first got to get to know one another. And Anna's interests focus on European and Eurasian energy markets, security, and energy policy. And for today's discussion, we're going to have Anna kick it off to talk about the current state and needs of Europe's energy markets and beyond, helping us to grasp many challenges the EU faces in realizing its clean energy and security visions. But before I ask Anna to begin, just a few things for those of you that have joined us. Questions, please do send them along the way via Zoom chat. Please make sure your Zoom option is on. And note that our experts will speak for roughly 7-10 minutes, somewhere in there a piece, and then we'll open it up for some questions I have and hopefully that you'll be presenting as well. So with that, I turn the floor over to Anna. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Richard, for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everybody for being here. I wanted to kind of start this chat with drawing on three distinctions that could help us with setting up a framework of understanding the potential for the US-EU collaboration in global clean. So the first one would be the distinction on the emission reduction in those two entities. So, and it's very important distinction because also it determines the way the countries act upon the global clean, but also in terms of how they want or how they wish to address emission reduction and so on. So in the EU, those emission reductions are generally, or to a greater extent, policy-based. In the US, they truly rely much more than on policy. They rely on market, particularly on cheap natural gas that's domestically available, and also on increasingly cheaper renewables nowadays. So, and that makes a difference. In EU, natural gas, for example, that would allow coal to gas switching is much more expensive, or at least was much more expensive. Current situation is very different. And also it's not domestically available, or at least it's not sufficiently available, which begs a question of energy security and ability to access, whether based on potential issues related to supply sources or just price. And therefore, it's almost easier to have a policy that provides a push for renewable, for example, generation, as opposed to coal to gas switching, or at least both of them at the same time. In the US, it's different. We've seen this market kind of driven coal to gas switching in power generation that, interestingly, hasn't been even impeded by the policies of current administration that were trying to achieve that. We're trying to kind of push for coal, and they really were not able to hamper the market push for natural gas as a cheap, cleaner fuel, and more future, kind of having more future than coal potentially in the US and globally. Renewable power has also been pushed with the market sources market forces much cheaper. But it's interesting to point out that before the shale revolution, there has been in the US a policy push for renewable generation or renewable power, much more so than it is now, and it related specifically to what US is currently to what EU is currently reacting. There's more expensive natural gas not available domestically. So there are specific forces that have been working in these two areas, EU and the US, that make it more difficult for those two places to see eye to eye in several matters. Second distinction that I wanted to draw is the distinction within the EU, and it's an important one because a lot of people, when we talk about EU, we kind of tend to generalize EU this, EU that, EU adopted the European Green Plan, and so on. But it's not so easy. Or it's not so uncomplicated. All the countries within the EU are not the same when it comes to how they relate to emission reductions, how they see the green plan that's being currently enacted. In fact, Poland has opposed it, and the plan has been actually enacted without Poland subscribing to it. And we see this kind of really distinction between the so-called West and the so-called East, which I would include the mostly post-Soviet countries, which are less developed, which are much more coal-intensive, but also these countries are developing at a higher level than the Western Europe, and also within they are at the different level of development. So Western Europe, you see more kind of switch to services, less energy intensity, whereas in the East, you see more energy intensive industries, but also kind of the heritage that they brought from the post-Soviet era, much less developed, much less interconnected markets when it comes to electricity, natural gas, and therefore their approach to how much they can reduce emission and when is different. And we've seen this disagreement again and again. We've seen that EU is not necessarily able, or not necessarily all the countries are able to reach, or they are not actually currently on track to reach the pollution emissions level that are set up for 2030. So it's not as kind of straight, cut and dry when it comes to Europe on that front. And also for the eastern part, or the post-Soviet part, actually gas, which EU has often been saying, oh, it's a fossil fuel, we need to get away from it. We need to make sure that going forward, we are going to be relying on clean sources. Well, it is a cleaner alternative for many of the post-Soviet countries right now. So if you end up with natural gas, it will be better than the coal generation that exists or could be built going forward. So that's important. And now going to this third distinction that I want to draw, that kind of builds up on this division within the EU. Well, there's also the global division that we need to think of. The division between developed countries, where both EU and US are, and the developing world. And one thing that's very important is that going forward, it's the developing world that's going to be responsible for any additional emissions, truly. Most of the growth is going to go from their economic growth, population growth. And when we talk about reducing emissions, reducing greenhouse gases, we really need to think of how we can help that new development to be less carbon heavy. And in that way, this kind of, again, gives a different role to the US and EU beyond decarbonizing themselves. Because sure, we can decarbonize ourselves. We can be the, Europe can be, carbon neutral by 2050. We can also be producing much fewer emissions. But the issue is it going to actually count? To the extent that if we use less oil or less natural gas, is it going to be cheaper now for the developing world to buy more of it? And the truth is, when it comes to developing world, they will want to develop as fast and as much as possible, and they will look for the cheapest available options. And this could be natural gas. This could be also coal. And coal is important because it's much more widely distributed, often domestically available. It's easy to store. The infrastructure already exists, and it offers a lot of jobs. So this is something that when the developed world is thinking about, helping the global clean, it really needs to think about how the actions locally in the developed world affect the global environment, and what could be the potential also negative negative impacts, or that could actually go against what that developed world is hoping for. And in that, I think I want to give now some time to Kyle. I think he will build up on those remarks. Thank you. Kyle?
Kyle? And
I am technology challenged today.
Okay, okay. There you go. There you go. Now
there we go. No.
Excellent.
So I do apologize, but Anna, thank you for those comments, and Rich for your introduction. And you hit on some interesting things and important things. One of which I think is that emissions. The goal is to reduce emissions if we're going to address the whole climate opportunity or requirement. It's not an opportunity. It is an opportunity, yes, but it's really a requirement that we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Just to focus on that and not to focus so much on the fuel sources. And when we begin to do that, if we set the emissions reduction targets properly, and you see various governments doing it, you've got the Paris agreements, you've got companies stepping in, big companies saying emissions are to net zero by 2050. How does one get there? And if you focus on the emission, it opens up a tremendous opportunity for technology innovation and system integration that we have, when you take a binary choice of no fossil fuels and all renewables, you don't get the mutual benefit of the two things. Now, the benefit wouldn't be there if you can't have, if you don't have the technologies that are able to use the fossil fuels without emissions. But more and more of those technologies are coming. There's been the focus on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. There's been a lot of post-combustion capture technology that is not new, but is coming more into focus. And then you've got the carbon storage of enhanced oil recovery, and then more and more dedicated storage, CO2 storage systems around the world. There are also new technologies coming along that I'll just name one is net power, where it utilizes natural gas to make electricity, but has no emissions and captures large volumes of CO2 that were never emitted to the atmosphere that can then be used for other activities or just stored permanently. So system innovation, integration, focused on emissions reductions. And then, as Anna pointed out, every country has a different requirement for power and energy. One consistent requirement is reliability, 24/7, always on electricity. The U.S. enjoys that. Europe enjoys that. We've achieved it in different ways. Many parts of the world enjoy it, but some parts do not, and they want it and will demand it. And they will use the resources that are available to them at the most cost-effective manner. System integration and technology innovation is, I think, really a big opportunity for the U.S. and Europe, not only for our own objectives, but since climate change is a global issue and markets around the world are going to demand it, for us to work in concert to build on our capabilities. One of the things that will do that will be, when I say system integration, I'm thinking in many ways, if you look at natural gas, from the wellhead to the burner tip, and to develop global systems recognizing emission reductions all the way through the system, whether it's methane at the wellhead, no loss of methane through the pipes, and ultimately power generation, if you're talking liquefaction, using all electric equipment to liquefy it. And then as you then move it around the world where it's used, it will help the economics of a lot of projects if they can take credit for the emissions that go all the way back to the source of the fuel. And then if you integrate renewables into the systems so that you gain the efficiencies of wind and solar when the resource is available, and storage to the extent it agrees, then the natural gas can back you up and give you the 24/7 reliability. You look long into the future and you'll see the opportunity in many countries that now may have a coal resource that they can mine it, they can put it on a truck, they can bring it where it needs to go. But as their industries develop and their commercial systems develop, and they become using a combination of gas and renewables, they will begin to develop their own gas resources to the extent they have them there. And if the combustion or the end-use technology has no emissions, those are great advantages. So this period that we're going through of social distancing, people wanting to become more, seemingly wanting to become more reliant on their own resources, may lead to that opportunity in the future. In the meantime, people have discovered that that they can see mountains in places they couldn't see them before. They can see fish in Venice. They've got birds nesting in places they didn't realize, and animals moving around. You combine that desire and what people know is out there with this innovation, and create a regulatory system that recognizes the emissions reductions or mitigation, or just no emissions from the source of the fuel to its end use. And there's tremendous opportunity there for all the industries and people in the U.S. and Europe to work together. I'll stop at that and turn it back.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Kyle. I'll commence with the moderator's prerogative with a couple of questions. One is, you're certainly looking at least under this administration here in the United States, and under previously under Secretary Perry, excuse me. There was a tremendous, because things have been rather thrown out of order with COVID. But up until COVID, there was a very consistent outreach vis-a-vis the 3 Cs initiative and other means by which alternatives for natural gas sources, particularly vis-a-vis liquefied natural gas, were being presented in Europe and being promoted, whether that was down in the East Mediterranean, working with Greek NATO ally Greece, or working in and around the Baltic Sea. And that's great. My conversations with a lot of folks that are focused on European policy and energy indicate like, well, yes, but there's so much natural gas right now that's out there. I'm curious as to, in addition to the technology, that's one place where the government can hopefully provide some incentives, and maybe some of the technologies, Kyle, that you think are closer to coming online. I'd like to hear about that. But Anna, from both of you actually, Anna in particular, what leverage does the U.S. have then? I mean, if so much of this has been placed on the export of liquefied natural gas right now in a market where it's in abundance, then what else can at least policymakers that want to promote U.S. energy do right now in order to maintain as much as possible an American share of the European market?
Well, at first we need to make sure that everybody kind of is on the same page. When the U.S. administration comes into Europe and, for example, it promises Juncker or the Polish President Duda or whoever else that they will bring natural gas from the U.S., it is not possible because U.S. administration does not own those resources. So it's an expression of kind of, common goal, but really it's the companies that would bring that gas, the private companies that will now bring that gas, depending on whether market forces make it, possible, meaning where it's profitable. And depending on this, you will see the U.S. gas coming in or not. And by that, but there is several things that administration can do. I mean, obviously, being friendly towards the endeavor is great, but also U.S. gas could not flow to those areas had it been not for the fact that there has been a development in infrastructure, right? So we've had a LNG terminal being built that was built in Lithuania and opened 2014, I think, end of 2014, 2015. Then in Poland, that's now being actually expanded. There is one that's being in the late planning at Krk in Croatia. There is increasing development in Greece for LNG terminals that can provide actually LNG going to Bulgaria, for example. So we've seen this. These developments are very important because now they allow diversification of the region that until now has really relied mostly on Russian gas. And some countries, in 100%, they have relied on Russian gas. And that made them not only weaker party to the bargain when it comes to economic terms in terms of prices, but also in terms of possible geopolitical implications. So I think, was it 2 years ago already? Myself and together with my colleague, we actually wrote a larger piece on how U.S. government could help U.S. gas and generally that region to diversify and become less dependent on one specific source. And we suggest actually U.S. government being involved in helping the infrastructure. Not necessarily bringing in gas, but having infrastructure that now could bring gas. That being said, any gas. Will it be Qatari LNG? Will it be US LNG? We do not imagine a specific condition, whereas that infrastructure would bring only American gas, because this would be an issue internationally, right? When it comes to trade, WTO, and so on. But what will happen? It will actually expand the global market, and by displacement will also help U.S. gas. And creating this global market much more liquid, much more liberal, much deeper with more providers, more also demand centers. It would help decreasing any geopolitical power, and it has helped already within the Central and Eastern Europe and Southeast Europe, but also decrease pricing, and by that help with changes to, for example, coal to gas switching and helping environmentally also. So it would be energy security benefits, but also environmental benefits and economic benefits.
And has that?
So.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kyle.
No, I was just going to add to that. I mean, one of the things that all of these actions require governments talking to one another and government interaction. And one of the things that I think needs to happen is the U.S. needs to get back to the table of climate discussions, because a lot of the policy initiatives that governments could undertake, and I spoke just a minute before about this, is allowing the cross-border emission reductions to count within a country. That will help make the market more efficient, but it also helps to internalize the cost of reducing greenhouse gas emissions into the fuel. If for instance, if the U.S. producer could get credit for no methane emissions or no from its source or the pipeline, and no emissions at all from the liquefaction of the fuel, of the gas, when it's up to the point that it's delivered to the customer, whether it be in Europe or anywhere else, if the customer could get the benefit of that reduction, it would help, it would provide more money for infrastructure development because they're not paying for fuel. It would also raise the price, which may not be a good thing, but it might raise the price of some of the competing fuels around the world and give an advantage to the cleaner product. So I think coming back to the taking a seat back at the table on these climate discussions will be beneficial to everyone.
Well, they may be beneficial to everyone, save one particularly large global player at this juncture, and that would be China. And we talked a little bit about this next week. Our discussion then had focused in part on what you raised today, that there needs to be this focus on the developing world, because that's where we're going to see the greatest degree of growth in the coming decades. And it's going to be, from their perspective, needs to be as cost effective as possible. And so that's basically going to be driven by whatever the easiest resources are available, or the most simply accessible resources are available. We know that China, in its pursuit of energy sources around the world, has, despite a lot of a public diplomacy campaign of being behind clean energy, being behind clean energy technology, that is a very small part of a picture whereby China has been actually going out and trying to just get as many sources as it can in order to feed its, probably not erstwhile, but for the moment, the country's economic growth has been on pause. And so I guess my question is, China's at a place where they're trying to be the ones to sort of set the standards as much as they can in the developing world about what is or isn't going to be sort of acceptable in respect to energy usage. And meanwhile, what we see here, at least what I see in Europe and what I've seen here in the United States, is that the conversation has really just been focused as a domestic issue and not recognizing that there's a real leadership role that the US and the European Union could play. Could you talk about a little bit about the China dimension? I mean, are there ways to work with China? Are there opportunities that are being missed because, for example, we're so domestically focused right now that there are markets or technologies that could be going into those markets that developing countries are unaware of or simply aren't cost feasible, or are they?
I can start, because I think one thing that I think we need to notice, it's, yes, China has quite a lot of has been talking quite a lot about developing renewable power themselves, renewable capacity themselves, and also renewable energy technology, being at the forefront of energy technology, investing in renewable energy, and so on. And that's fine. However, there are several caveats. Well, one of them is that a lot of, or at least some of the renewable energy capacity that's in China actually cannot provide, is far away from demand centers. And what it means, there is also not enough grid developed that can actually bring all that energy that's being produced to the demand centers. And at the end, I had a graduate student, I think a year or two ago, who actually did a paper on that. And she's shown that a significant amount of that energy, renewable energy that's produced, is being curtailed because there's no way of sending it to the consumer. So looking only at capacity it can kind of be misleading. Now, China has huge amount of investment in renewable energy. However, it also has a lot of investment in coal. And it's not only in China. So we have a lot of coal-fired power plants being built and planned in China. But going further, actually, China has, and I kind of wrote this down, has 60 new coal plants across Eurasia, South Asia, and Africa, total about 70.3 gigawatts, financed almost exclusively by Chinese banks. Mm-hmm. So these are the things that we need to look at the country's record when they are telling us where they are in terms of global clean or renewable power. We have to look inside what's happening domestically. We have to look at outside what's happening with their investment outside and what type of investments there are. And we see what China is doing. China is truly diversifying its portfolio. First of all, in terms of energy, it's bringing in renewable, it's still using coal, it's bringing in a lot of natural gas from different sources, LNG and piped gas through Russia, for example, or Turkmenistan and other places. So we see that diversification, making sure that its energy security is intact. And it looks really at its own interest, not necessarily, and it plays to the specific issues, wanting to get credit. But looking at the whole picture, we see that more energy security pictures emerging and making sure that the country develops rather than kind of really being concerned about the climate issues. And I think that's what needs to be underscored. But also those investments that China is making, being it renewable, being it coal, being it natural gas, in terms of infrastructure outside, infrastructure that brings this energy, makes China very influential in those places. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, what we kind of need to remember, because when we think about, US investment, it's often private companies that invest outside. For China, Chinese investments, actually Chinese state investing, whether it's a Chinese bank or Chinese company, it's Chinese state investing. And that means that it brings direct power, bargaining power or whatever, geopolitical power to Chinese state. And I think that's what we need to really understand. And our focus on renewable needs to, has been actually used by China. Kind of, China almost kind of grabbed that idea of renewable and went with it because it doesn't need to worry about future elections. It's kind of, it's horizon. It's much longer term horizon. So it can play to specific developments very quickly, not needing to worry about direct kind of backlash and immediate backlash from its population.
Kyle?
Well, I would say, all those things are very important. And if you look at China's, they have invested a lot in renewables. One, I hear, and others would know more about this than I, that they are looking to impose an internal tax on carbon, price on carbon. That would be a very solid thing. They've made great strides with CCUS, and I think are getting more comfortable with some of the capture technologies. They've got vast oil fields that are available to store the CO2. So the things that they do in country, I think, are really important. But there has to be a way to create a disincentive for them to provide low-cost fuel with these power plants that are being built around the world, because to an extent they're simply exporting the CO2, the greenhouse gas emissions, to another place. Mm-hmm. And by providing the lowest cost fuel. So somehow there needs to be agreement around the globe on a price on carbon, beyond just setting targets for emission reductions and providing for carbon offsets. Carbon offsets are a wonderful thing. Reforestation is a great thing to do. But if you really want to address this and reach the goals of Paris and by 2050, you're going to have to stop emitting. And that cost of emission needs to be put more into the product. So again, I go back to global action, the Europeans and with the U.S. back at the table and working with the developing nations to create a global system of pricing carbon so that you can't just export your emissions to another country for profit's sake.
Mm-hmm. So I have another question if there aren't any yet from the audience. All right. Well, so, one thing that you mentioned, Kyle, was, this, that there continues to be this sort of binary perspective. It's all carbon-based fuels are bad. Renewables are only good, or renewables are, they're just not simply effective. They're not going to be able to meet the reliability demands that a growing economy will place on it. And I'm interested to hear sort of, if there's ignorance or misunderstanding around this kind of binary narrative, what's a step that can be taken, but not only for policymakers, but also for those who are market actors in reducing this. There are a number of folks on the call today that I've had the pleasure of getting to know from my trips to Houston and whatnot, and they work in the energy. And in conversations that I've had, there's, I get a sense that there's a disconnect, because a lot of what we're talking about today is that there's nothing wrong with natural gas, provided you find a way to be able to use it cleanly, as in no emissions. So, where's the messaging getting messed up, and maybe how can it be improved to open people's minds up to, the ways that there can be a middle path towards achieving, on one level, economic prosperity for the energy industry and those that benefit from it in their communities, and the greater goals that the policy community and that many in Europe and America have towards a cleaner environment?
I'll start on that one. I think Anna hit it early in the conversation, which is the target needs to be emission reductions and emission eliminations, not technology choices. And you limit your capability to achieve your objective immediately when you say, well, we're not going to use those types of technologies because it's a fossil fuel, for instance. It's sort of like, this is a rough example, but if you go to nobody buys blood diamonds anymore because you should not do that. It fosters bad actions. If you create a system where no one will buy fuels that have emissions associated with them, you will get to the same end where people will not do it. But to say, as the debate has not matured, I think is the answer to your question. It's not lack of knowledge. It may be some of that. It's people latch on to what they know, and they know that renewables have no emissions to the atmosphere. They don't necessarily think about what it takes to make some of these renewable things. But the more the knowledge of where the fuels come from, how the systems come together, what it takes not to emit, and what happens when you put these systems together. I mean, if you have, it is possible to use electricity, to use natural gas to make electricity and have zero emissions. It's also possible to integrate renewables with those systems and have, produce less natural gas, if that's what one of your objectives is. But you can't have reliable electricity if you only rely on renewable power. We're not there yet on storage. Someday we will get there, I'm sure. But in the meantime, you can use these other systems. So I think knowledge, better communication, And I think a commitment by investors, I mean, the comments that the commitment that has come out of BlackRock at the beginning of the year and some of the Goldman Sachs and others that they are going to begin to, not begin, but they're going to limit or not invest in energy companies that have emissions. And that is the kind of thing that begins to focus the people that provide energy. So I think it's a maturing of the discussion and having more people coming to the table and taking this extremely seriously, which seems to be happening.
Anna, ideas about how we can maybe accelerate the maturity of this discussion?
I think it's important to understand that, and I think I think we've seen the slow steps towards kind of viewing the energy transition in a more comprehensive way. Because truth be told, if we're really thinking that energy transition is 100% renewables, it's not the question of the climate debate. And as Kyle asked, and I always ask it in my class, my student, what is the goal? And oftentimes they say, well, renewables are the goal for the climate change. And it's really not. It's the emissions. And by that token, you expand your potential solutions to emissions to much broader choices. And, you know, you might be doing research on several things, and one of them might click. It might be storage. It might be that you are able to be, you know, to use 100% renewable, but it might be CCS. It might be hydrogen. And because of this, we need to think about allowing this R&D, research and development, in many areas that will provide the ultimate goal, which is emission reduction or no emissions whatsoever. I think that's very important. And we've seen slowly maturing of this discussion. So when you look at IEA reports, and also BP has actually, I think, kind of has been even earlier, over the last 2 years, you've seen kind of this going away from 100% renewable to we cannot really achieve the emissions reduction level with renewable only. Let's look at other technologies. And we've seen kind of coming back to carbon capture and storage, which 3-4 years ago was like, oh, this is too expensive, we cannot do this. But now there is a back kind of how we can do this possibly. Also, hydrogen has become extremely important. And I think in that, it kind of also allows countries to kind of transition much less sharply in a way that a lot of the infrastructure that comes from the older kind of path dependent almost, you know, energy development could be used for those new technologies. And that's very important. So when you think about now the countries that are, you know, investing in natural gas infrastructure, like in Central and Eastern Europe, that will help them now at this very moment, that there is no other solution to help them now in terms of emission targets. Well, they're investing in infrastructure that they will be having hard time abandoning in 10 years. That infrastructure is supposed to be working for the next 30, 40, 50 years, right? So the same goes with gas-fired power plants. So we have to think about kind of how to incorporate those choices in our future solutions too. Or other ways, we're gonna have an issue with this path dependency and inability to kind of go one step forward. So oftentimes what you see, we're gonna go 3 steps forward, full renewable, as opposed to kind of moving one step after another and allowing everybody to adjust and how adjust in a way that's gonna be viable economically for that country and possible with using all the you know, infrastructure or all that money that has been invested already.
I would emphasize that it's every place has a different set of resources, a different set of economics, a different set of previous investments, and a different growing population and different energy demands. And taking those things into account and bringing all the tools that one has to bear with a goal, which is no emissions, no more climate change, greenhouse gases, will create a lot of opportunity and thinking and creativity out there that's right now not at its most robust.
And I think I would also add political aspect of this, and particularly even this kind of distinguish between the non-democracies versus democracies. So given kind of a Polish example, really, which is very coal dependent, has been traditionally, and has been having really tough time getting out of coal, going away from coal, despite the EU push for non-coal options. And we've seen and again, and it might be mind-boggling for some, that EU has been pushing, and Poland has been pushing back to the point that it literally hasn't signed the Green Deal. Why this is the case? Well, once, yes, the country is dependent highly on coal, it will take time, it will be expensive, they need to find different ways. Renewables are not that strong. It's not that much sun there. You have to build still wind power, but there's also a political aspect. And in Poland, particularly, the mining community is very concentrated in the area that provides approximately a quarter of seats in the parliament. Very close elections in that area, which means any government, doesn't matter right or left, any government that will go against the wishes of that very concentrated, often unionized population, which means they're politically active, they will vote against that. And it's very easy to lose elections. And given that Polish elections are also very close in general, this creates disincentive to any government, doesn't matter what ideology, to actually get away from coal. And that's why you see such a push against EU. And that's why also you see that EU is quite lenient on Poland, because it understands that for the government, its immediate survival depends on whether or not they will win the next elections, not EU. And that's very important. And that's why you also see not such a huge push in, for example, in India for renewable power. We see a lot of coal, we see some gas, renewable power versus China, which has much more advanced. Well, it's easier for Chinese government to push for that. It does not directly and quickly has to respond in elections to what the population needs. And that's not the case in India, where you have actually federal government on top of this. So kind of something also else to think about when you think it's beyond economy, beyond technology, there's political factors. And we've seen this in the US as well in the last elections, that there is political factors that might still prolong, and that the fossil fuel use or emissions, and that should be addressed, because otherwise they will be difficult to get over.
Thank you very much for that dose of reality there, Anna. I think everyone on this call sort of would like to see a more sort of robust agenda on all these fronts. As robust was the word that Kyle used, but yeah, indeed, there are some very pragmatic considerations that need to be taken into account in terms of what your vision might be and what the reality is. And I was hoping today that we would be able to flush some of those out, and I feel that we've been very successful. What USEA, as I indicated in the beginning, is seeking to do is try to find those areas where even if there's some controversy around them, that there is a way to find a compromise, and that mutual interests can be equally met, or at least proportionally met. Your remarks today, I think, have provided a lot of clarity and some optimism in that respect. And I want to thank you very much for your contributions, and everyone who attended today. We've gone over a little bit, so I'm going to sign off right now. We're going to encourage everyone to continue to tune in to our Transatlantic Chat series as it goes on through the summer. And I look forward to, of course, any feedback that anyone sat in today might have in respect to the discussion. And I hope that it's one that's going to continue. This isn't going to be the only time we're going to talk about energy in the transatlantic community, because it's far too vital to our common interests, and whether it be security or economic, but certainly in respect to a cleaner world going forward. So thank you all once again for attending today, and keep following USEA in the future. All the best.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Rich. Take care. Bye, Anna.
Bye, Kyle.